Welcome to Becoming Parents Podcast. I'm your host, Jennifer Campbell. I'm a doula in Washoe County, Nevada, a Medicaid provider, a lactation educator, childbirth educator, and mom of 18. You can find me and connect on doulainreno.com. Remember, give a shout out to those who are brave enough to share their stories with us on how they have become parents. Let's dive in. Welcome to the Becoming Parents Podcast. I'm your host, Jennifer Campbell. Today I'm on with Emily Encinosa, and we worked really hard to get onto this call today.
Yes,
Thank you
we
for
did.
being here.
Absolutely. It's my pleasure. I'm so excited to be here and to talk with you.
This is a bonus episode because you actually live in Vegas, which is a 7-hour drive from me, but we're in the same state, so we're local. And jump in and start telling me about your parenting journey.
So I had been a doula and a midwife for a few years before I became a parent. Actually, I got into birth work in 2017, and I got doula certified at Well-Rounded Mama and through Doula, and I did a doula apprenticeship with Well-Rounded Mama, which was a maternity center, or they're still around. They opened about like 15 years ago, and it was ran by a few midwives, and then they had doulas, lactation consultants, childbirth education. I taught our fitness classes. I actually began my journey as a fitness instructor in New York City, and then I moved to Vegas in 2013. And I started specializing in prenatal Pilates and postpartum Pilates and helping support pregnant bodies through movement. And then in postpartum too. And I heard a lot of trauma that was coming from women. And they were like, okay, I can get back to myself finally when my kids are grown. And I'm like, oh, that sounds awful. Like, how can we do this better for people, especially when this is such a sacrificial thing that we're going through, not knowing what matrix science was at the time. And so I then got into doula work, and then I started my midwifery apprenticeship in 2019, and I got pregnant in 2020 with my son. So my pregnancy was quite different. Yeah.
Terrible timing.
Yeah.
Terrible timing.
Well, and I didn't stop. Like, I was going into delivering babies. I was taking care of clients the whole time, dealing with a lot of their uncertainties. We had some traumatic births that in even like I didn't get very much of the same things that I was giving and trying to establish for my clients and receiving for myself. So it was really, especially in postpartum, like becoming a parent, I've actually transitioned big time my practice so that I can be more present with my son. And the great thing about what I do is we're teaching these moms how to mother. So what a better example to lead by it. And it got to a point where I felt like I wasn't incongruent and in alignment with what I was telling my clients, even on like a personal level. As far as taking care of yourself, burnout in birth work is very real for a lot of people, and it's hard to sustain. And so in postpartum, it was quite hard, not only going through a pandemic, but the isolation and having to take on other people's experiences throughout their births as well affected me. And there was a friend of mine that had taken a class with me, and she had a unfortunate outcome, and that even was hard that I took on in postpartum. And so I think that there's a lot that you carry with not only becoming a parent, but doing that in birth work at the same time, and through a time that there was so much heaviness. But now I'm home with my son most days, and it's really beautiful. He just turned 3 in November. We have annual passes to Disneyland, and so on the side I do like travel agent stuff, but I like Disney history, and I get to do my fun free time stuff with him and my family there. So I've really been able to transition my work to a much more sustainable practice now that the pandemic is over, but focusing on being more intentional with even my clients, the people who come into my life trust me as their provider, and I want to also still feed into that relationship. Now I get to bake my clients a meal, I have time, I'm not so busy, and that fulfills me, baking and taking care of my family. And cooking and feeding my family, nutritional food is really important in how I show up as a parent. That's a foundational thing for me. So even being able to, I had a lot of postpartum depression, and rage even. And to get to the place where I can make food for other people and have that capacity to hold space again is profound. It took a lot of healing and a lot of time for me to get back to myself.
I have so many directions I want to go right now. I think the first thing I want to ask is, you were practicing as a doula and
Hmm.
going through the process of becoming a midwife. So I
Hmm.
spent 12 years in Alaska. Um,
Yeah.
well, I was there for about 10, and I was off and on a birth assistant for midwives and for home birth practice, thinking I'm going to be a midwife.
Yeah.
But I had to give it up because of family and because of all the things, right? And then when I went back to it a couple of years ago, which I'm eternally blessed, I got to go back to birth work. I looked at NARM, I looked at Nevada state law, and I was like, it's not the same space that it was 15 to 20 years ago. And
No.
I decided that I definitely did not want to go the midwife route because of that. So that's one thing in there I'd like to touch on. Another thing is,
Sure.
how different did your practice change? Um, after having a child? It's so hard for me to separate this with you because you were in the pandemic also, which was a very
Yeah. I
unnatural
know.
couple of years.
Time.
So
Yeah.
I mean, you had this birth within the pandemic. You had the change from being a doula to a midwife
Hmm.
before and after having a baby. So maybe it's just better to kind of verbally vomit that to you and decide how
Yeah.
you want to do it. Because I interviewed a pediatrician who was like, as a pediatrician before being a parent, I didn't understand why parents were asking me all the things they were asking me, because I'm just a pediatrician. I'm here for your child. And then I became a parent and I was like, holy cow, now I know why, as a pediatrician, they're coming to me with all this. And it completely changed her practice because
Yeah.
she looked at it through a different lens. And you have been able to do that with birth work. And I don't know how the pandemic affected all of us, but I don't know how that wove into your story, I guess.
So I actually am pretty sure I was asymptomatic. They thankfully didn't test me, but my water ruptured at 37 and 5. I was getting ready to go to
Oh,
another birth, and I was feeling okay, but just tired that day. Nothing crazy, and needed to lay down. And then it was time for us to go to someone who wanted to, like, they so in your phases you're like a primary under supervision, and
mm-hmm.
so this person had came into care wanting to work with me, and obviously everybody that was there was fantastic and they had met too, but it was a bummer because I wanted to be at that birth, and she was texting me while like, hey, how are you doing? But my water broke, and my water was ruptured for a few days before I finally made the decision to transport to the hospital.
Oh,
And
wow.
I did transport, and I ended up in a cesarean because I had gotten epidural, and they were like, well,
Okay.
let's give you Pitocin and just have a baby. And I was like, I'm tired. I've been doing this on and off for like 3, 4 days. I had gone to the chiropractor, and my labor had finally picked up. And I got to 6 centimeters, right? Like as I was getting to the hospital. Um, but my contractions were just not in a regular pattern. And I knew that being in birth, and also had seen this kind of play out before throughout COVID. I understood that at this point it was like a fair decision to go mainly get antibiotics. But I also know what Pitocin is not a really comfortable thing, and I was tired, and so I let my fear dictate that decision and getting an epidural first. And I don't necessarily regret that because it's so many times that I've seen it where it hasn't been an issue. It is very uncommon. It's kind of Murphy's Law having that happen. So I got the epidural placed, and the anesthesiologist even said something to me about it. And I was like, it's fine. Like, I totally understand the risk and it's okay. And he came back and was like, okay, so this is what happened. And then we went back for a C-section. In postpartum, they were awful to me. And this was a hospital that I have transferred to, like, had doula clients before. The people who were taking care of me, the OB-GYN that was the laborist there, he's fantastic and did an incredible job. The anesthesiologist was really good, but the pediatrician was so opinionated. And it was interesting because that's what triggered, I think, a lot of my postpartum anxiety and knowing. So like the hardest part for me was knowing as a care provider, knowing what I know. And every time I would get stressed about my baby with respirations or jaundice or whatever that was, my midwife would be like, well, what would you tell your clients? And I'm like, it's not the same thing right now. I know what I would tell my clients, but I need to hear like feedback that everything is okay. And so for me, that actually really changed. Having gone through like each phase of having a labor, laboring at home, having a natural birth, being, having natural contractions, then going to the hospital, getting an epidural, and then finally having a C-section. I actually specialize in prenatal and postpartum Pilates. So I am very well versed in recovery. So it wasn't something as scary as it normally feels, I think, to other people. And what I hear, like when I'm with a client, usually they're like, oh my God, like the last thing that I want is to have a C-section. And that's very fair to feel that way. But I think that's also because we don't talk about like realistic expectations sometimes and what that looks like. And sometimes when it is necessary, I have seen that in my clients' labors where in mine, like it was unfortunately because of the fever. So the baby had to come out. But with labors that are just no longer progressive, and they've arrested, we've tried all the things. I've seen that where we have transported and given them all the time in the world to do everything. And that is like the one solution at that point. And how do we make that a different experience, right? How can we make that more empowering? Because it's not the end of the world. I 100% do not regret or feel like it was, which is rare. And I totally understand that that is a huge contributing factor. Knowing, being a doula, being educated, having people in my corner, they actually did allow my midwife and my doula to come into the hospital with me because I had a relationship with them. So I was really lucky and fortunate to not actually have the experience that most people did have in the hospital when I was there, except for the unfortunate timing in postpartum. But it led me to also reinforce that, like, God doesn't put anything broken on this planet, or whatever your higher belief is, right? Like, babies aren't broken. So when they're brought here, that is not the story. And we have a medical system that is pretty much always looking at something to fix, right? And so being able to reinstall our knowledge, our wisdom in ourselves as a care provider, was something pretty foundational for me. So moms are always worried about like babies breathing, and I'll talk, like, especially first time parents, right? That's a common, like, is my baby breathing? Or I didn't sleep because my baby was sounding so weird all night and grunting. And so I will remind them, like, this is the high respiration. This is what retractions look like, send a video and a picture if you have any questions, but like, this is what to look for, kind of on, giving them some knowledge and power to have ownership over, like, okay, or like listening to them, because I always tell people too, I'm in the business of listening and hearing you. As a care provider, as women, we don't often get that. And so as a midwife, that is my primary job, is to hear you and see you where you're at, and trying to meet you where you're at, as best as I can. And so for me, I think that was just the difference. Like, not always saying everything's fine, everything's totally good, your baby's good, your body's not broken. Like, so we are living in a very different place, like you recognized. And for me, actually, I'm choosing, I'm relocating to Maryland, where I'm from, my hometown, to get licensure to be able to practice there. We will probably have licensure here in the next couple of years. And the practice that I worked in helped put forth some regulations a couple legislative cycles ago for licensure. But it is a really hard place to practice when you don't have that here as a care provider, and birth has changed. And people have changed, I think, throughout the pandemic as well. We've seen that there is a different approach to birth and a viewpoint. So for me, I feel like it's been helpful to go through it myself. I like to, prior to being a parent, being available was really great, having all my attention given to my clients and being able to really be there for them. But being able to now actually come from a place of my own knowing and experience and say, yeah, it is hard. And
Yeah.
it does get better. And it does get better. Like I'm here, know that. We do have great resources in here in Las Vegas for like maternal mental health. I went
Mhm.
at 2 weeks postpartum and started getting help. And that's actually where I learned a lot about matrix science, and that it takes you a while to come into motherhood and yourself and who you are. And that was really hard for me. That was the hardest part because I had, when I found out I was pregnant, I was actually treated like it was a not good thing and it would affect my apprenticeship. Um, and so a lot of what I did was, and how I guess held myself, was that it wasn't like a negative thing. It I was just gonna work through it. And
Mm.
so I didn't give myself some of the same grace, some of the same kindness, even in postpartum. Taking time to pump was not always my focus when I was at a birth or in a prenatal day, when it really should have been like having those boundaries for myself, just like I really try to encourage with my clients. And that's because of the environment that I was in as well. It was frowned upon because we were needing to be students to help do the work, to learn. And there just was that need of us needing to be there. And I think sometimes too, when you're like removed from motherhood a little bit, early motherhood, it's harder to have empathy in that space. Maybe not
Mhm.
for everyone, but um, I think that was where sometimes that came from as far as in my practice. But it was just interesting. I felt like I didn't expect to like being a midwife and being for mothers and families and promoting the family dynamic. I wasn't expected to be met with pushback when I
Right.
then went into that for myself. I thought that that would be like an even flow. And even from my clients, I don't think that I ever had clients that would like didn't like that I had a child. But it was harder to sometimes then establish boundaries around my time off and phone calls, and keeping questions sometimes that just weren't necessary to their appointment times, um, which is probably what we all have to go through in our practices anyway. But
Mhm.
it's a huge step in parenthood, because when I had my child, it was hard. I wanted to work. I wanted to be working. I'd rather be at a birth for 12 to 24 hours some days than home with my crying kid, because it felt hard and I didn't have a lot of sleep and I didn't have any support to get it done. My mom lives in Maryland, and we didn't have family here. She couldn't meet my son until 6 months postpartum, because she has a heart transplant. And so she was high risk at that time and
Mhm.
didn't know about traveling. And we didn't have, I don't even think, I mean, that's another story, but there wasn't any like solution or precautions to take when traveling at that point. So it was
Right.
hard. She had to wait. So I didn't have anybody that was able to say, hey, like, and I was in clients' houses in postpartum helping. If I wasn't able to attend their birth, I was trying to give them extra postpartum care to be there. And some clients were okay with that, and some clients didn't feel super comfortable with that. So that was different for everybody. There was a lot of fear of the unknown and just being through something no one had experienced before.
Right, and as a
Um,
reminder, this was COVID. I mean, you're navigating
yes,
this through COVID, so it wasn't
yes.
like an easy thing, even for people like myself who were like, "This is the plandemic, and this is not
Hmm.
real, and this is" there were people getting sick, that was a real
Sure.
thing, but,
Oh yeah.
like, the gravity of it, I didn't think was as big as was being made, but you couldn't do anything about that.
Yeah, totally.
You walked in the store and you were told to put on a mask and you needed to do
Mhm.
it or you were escorted out. There wasn't like, there wasn't
Yes.
an alternative, like, I'll just do this instead. You were navigating
Yeah.
this. What I think frustrates me the most about your story, working in birth work right along with you, is that that should be the number one place for you to get the most personal support going
Mhm.
through your own journey, and it wasn't any different than corporate America, and that makes me really sad because I
Yeah.
know I know that here in Reno, in our area, we really support each other in this community, and what even just childcare in general. Like, you have a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old. It's not even pregnancy. Like, we really, really try to rally and support each other. And I think it should be that way everywhere. But
Hmm.
most in birth work, where, like, I know what you're going through
Yeah.
because I'm
Yeah.
working in it, and to not have that grace and be navigating it in a pandemic, that's just astounding. I do want to say, though, I wish no cesareans needed to take place, but
Oh,
we
for
both
sure.
know that they do, and
Yeah.
they save lives when they're necessary. You having gone through what you went through makes you better at what
Hmm.
you do.
Oh, for sure.
There's a physical therapist here in town, and she was a physical therapist before kids and went through a similar C-section scenario as you did, and got up to postpartum and was like, when does a physical therapist visit me?
Hmm.
Major abdominal surgery. Every other major surgery, PT is part of your recovery, right? And they're like, oh, we don't do that. Like, just walk it off,
Hmm.
pretty much. And it completely changed her practice, where now she focused on pregnant and postpartum
Yeah.
women. Why? Because she was already a PT, like you were already a doula, and then went through the experience herself and was like, are you kidding me?
Yeah.
And that makes you better. It makes you more
Hmm.
compassionate. It makes you understand how important those boundaries are. So I appreciate your experience in the sense that I know that that makes you better working with
Thank
other
you.
people, but sad that you had to go like,
Yeah.
just want to
Yeah.
slap people around for
I know.
not doing more for you when you needed more, when you were the postpartum mom. So,
Sure.
holy cow. I mean, it's an incredible journey that you've gone through. Now your son's 3,
Hmm.
and I'm super proud of you. Well, I'm proud of you that you're a doula, because you're a doula, but you're going through the process with NARM.
Hmm.
And I thought from my birth work experience, I would go right back into midwifery 2.5 years ago. I'm just going to pick up where I left off. And when I started that journey here in Nevada, I was like, maybe not going to do that, because
Hmm.
politics are different in every state, and certifications different in every state. And then there's NARM, who's the governing body of the US. And I think sometimes that's kind of like, you teach your child to drive to take the test, not to be a good driver.
Yes.
And that's kind of any governing body. Like, look, I don't need to learn to become a midwife and spend 4 years in school and $26,000 so I can pass your test. That's not making me a good midwife necessarily. It's making me pass that test so that I'm certified under a governing body. And that was hard for me to decide and navigate. So I'd love to hear some insight from you on that.
I agree about what you're saying with NAR. I think part of the reason why the PEP process is the way it is because of like the lack of oversight with what NARM is.
Yeah.
So having like a midwifery college definitely eliminates a lot of the abuses that go on through the PEP process. I absolutely agree with that.
Yeah.
And that is why for me I'm like, I think we will get licensure. That's inevitable at some point. It's been happening every session pretty much, so it's not something that we're going to be able to like ward off for a really long time, but I've never been against it. I think that having some standard of care and like guidelines as far as the requirements that you have to meet to be able to practice and keep your clients in care protect us, but also just help keep our clients informed in the decisions that they're making.
Yeah.
I think the space has changed a lot as far as people aren't always willing to be super accountable for their decisions. And so where do we have like that backing if that's our goal, if that's our job is to help them um you know make these informed decisions around their care, but then also give them our professional opinions and guidance so that they can be like have their informed consent and do their due diligence. If they're declining something and we're saying that's your right 100%, no big deal, right? Where is the protection on us? And without
Right.
having licensure, we don't have that. So I hear that. I
Yeah,
hear
no, I
your
just kind of was like,
concerns.
I'm just gonna wait this one out because
Yeah,
it's just an odd environment. And then with the legislation that I mean, then we could argue for hours about that. What does that look like?
sure.
Because we don't all agree. So, but I appreciate the fact that you were navigating these waters and doing all of this to go through. I knew that if I became a midwife, I would do it through NARM,
Yeah.
because I don't know if I'm ever going to move and I want to make sure I'm crossing all my T's and dotting my I's. And then I just decided I didn't want to go through that process
Yeah.
because it was so overwhelming. So I think we all have to navigate that differently ourselves. But yeah, I
Mhm.
appreciate that you figured out a way.
It was so hard. It
It's
was
so
I don't
hard.
know. So there's other
Yeah.
women that have been done their apprenticeships and they just haven't submitted because they're busy. They're busy in their practices. They start practicing. I don't think I would have been able to actually finish and like study and take my due diligence. I have all of my things for my bridge, so my plan is to sit for my exam, get that passed, and then submit my bridge certification, all of that for my advanced credential, and then I can apply for licensure in Maryland and anywhere.
Right.
Once you have your bridge, you
Right.
can go wherever there is licensure, which helps you to be flexible. But with Maryland, they have, and because we don't have licensure here, we can't pursue like an LM, which gives you a little bit more flexibility and unilateral movement as well.
Hmm.
When it comes to practicing, being able to practice in different birth centers around like different states' regulations. So it's interesting that you want that, right? Because we can't be, there has to be sustainability in what we do. We can't have like our own independent practices and be on call 24/7, 365 every day for women, especially when we have our own small children and families that we want to honor too.
Right.
And they deserve our time and we deserve our own time, because taking care of ourselves is how we're able to take care of everybody else.
I'd actually like to end on that. You talked about
Sure.
postpartum depression and setting boundaries, and I'd love for you to end us on a way that you felt good about being able to protect yourself and your family, set those boundaries, and get through postpartum depression as an encouragement for someone else.
Yeah.
Because most of us are going through that regardless of our careers.
Mhm. I reached out. I got in with a maternal mental health therapist right away.
Okay.
And they were able to help me set some boundaries, do some work on boundaries. My partner and I then got into couples therapy. And so, like, setting boundaries and having conversations around that. She actually first had me make a list of like my rules, like, what are some of my non negotiables for myself that I need to function and meet, and then like what are my expectations in these areas and what can people expect of me. And it felt really hard at the time because I was doing the bare minimum. I wasn't even like drinking water enough and eating food enough, right? That's such a huge thing. And thinking like, of course, I sounded like such a jerk when I talked to my clients as a trainer about this stuff. And really, it's like not sleeping that's causing that. So trying to get sleep when you can. I think hiring a postpartum doula, if you have the resources
Mhm.
to, having a friend come and hold your baby. And that's hard when you're breastfeeding. I felt like I would cry to my husband and be like, please just have somebody come in. And he's like, they're going to sit next to our bed and just hold the baby for you and then give him back like every hour and a half. He had um, tongue ties and we did a revision early on and all of that. So stretches every 2 hours around the clock, on top of navigating breastfeeding in like the first 2 weeks, which is so hard. But having some help postpartum and somebody that can help you like sleep, or getting some professional help from like a therapist. I think that is truly what helped me, because even as a professional, knowing the things, I had to have some accountability and
Mhm.
somebody else just to give me different ideas. Like I was talking to our feeding therapist that we go to for we send everybody for tongue ties and for that sort of therapy afterwards. um and I was like, it's okay, I'll just pump in like bottle feed, it's fine. And she's like, if you try it, like if you do this, that's fine, but you're always going to be doing that. So how can we change this? And in my mind, I just couldn't, he was not latching after doing the stretches. And she was like, well, do the feed him first or just switch it up. And I couldn't in my head like think of that. And it was like, oh my gosh, of course, like I've probably made that recommendation so many times, but being in that space, you either don't know because you've never done this before. This isn't a lived experience yet for you. Or you don't have somebody else that's there to say, hey, and also our parents, their opinions can also overweigh a lot of what we want to do and what our intuition is, and or our partners or the people that are around us are often influencing sometimes like the outside noise of how we're making those decisions. So having somebody that you can find that's in alignment with your values, how you practice, not practice, but how you want to show up for your family and in motherhood, or how just having a safe space, somebody that you can show up in your messy self and know, like, I'm okay, there's no judgment there. I think more women are showing up in that space for each other, which is really encouraging for sure. And I appreciate that because I try to be as transparent as possible. Like, I'm going to always be there for you. I'm going to be there for my family. And this is what you get. There's no different person in this setting, being in alignment with who you are. And that's hard. A lot of people don't know that. It takes a long time to get to yourself. In my 36th year, that's been the biggest theme. I've been laughing because I've been doing things thinking that I was going to learn something about myself. I did like a lip lab where you can make your own lip color. And I thought that they would like color match me and pick out this like crazy color that I would never pick for myself. And it was going to be so beautiful. And she's like, well, what color do you like? And I'm like, oh my gosh, I picked out the same color that I usually always gravitate towards. And I'm like, okay, I hear you. Another reminder. I know myself at 36 years old. I know my damn self.
Right.
And that is hard in motherhood when you don't feel like yourself and you're learning a newness, right? So coming back home, coming back to yourself.
Thank you so much, Emily, for being on. I
Thanks for
appreciate
having
you.
me. Yeah.